This is a perennial digression, an extended experiment in pretending that my graduate degrees were useful. My name is David Armstrong, but more importantly, I'm joined once again by David Bentley Hart, Canine Herald, baseball true believer, writer, novelist, philosopher, and theologian, author most recently of Roland and Moonlight and of Kinogaya, a Gnostic Tale, and of the forthcoming Tradition and Apocalypse, an essay on the future of Christian belief, and You Are Gods. David, thanks for agreeing to do this again. It continues to be a generous use of your time.
Thanks. I'm just trying to sell books, though. I don't know how generous it really is. So.
Well, I don't. My physical copy of Kinogaya is in the other room. Yes, I will. There will be links in the thing.
Okay. Well then.
Yeah. So I invited you on today to talk about a topic of mutual interest, one that you identified as something you intend to write about for your Substack, and one that I've not seen you invited on anywhere else to converse or discourse on, so I thought this could be fun today. I'm talking, of course, about Japanese aesthetics. To clarify up front, I'm obviously not Japanese. I've never had the chance to go to Japan. I'm not a scholar of Japanese. I don't know the language, and my appreciation for the nation's traditional and contemporary culture is purely amateur, basically. But like you, I do love it, and I want to try to increase my understanding of it because it seems to me that Japan's aesthetic tradition performs something like the unitive function in Japanese history that mainstream religions do in other cultural histories. So I want to start out just by asking, how did you become a Japanophile or a Shinichi? At what point in your formation did Japan's history and tradition stand out to you as being particularly important?
Well, yeah, I mean, importance, I don't know if it's a matter of importance, except personal importance to me. I've always, from a very early age, been fascinated with East Asian culture and Southeast Asian culture. I mean, that's something that started very early in life. The literature, the arts, the languages, to the degree that I've been able to study them. But over the years, more and more, I realized that I had a special fascination with Japanese aesthetic tradition. For a number, one is that it's so distinctive. I mean, it definitely stands apart on the one hand because of the intensity of the seriousness with which it's taken in traditional Japanese culture, that the perfecting of form at a very early period in Japanese history becomes more than a dilettante's concern. It's something that everyone, men and women, high and low, persons of every class are expected to regard as somehow central to a life well led. And then there's the sheer distinctiveness of the Japanese emphasis on blending the natural and the unadorned with human artifice in a way that has some precursors and some analogies in Chinese aesthetics, but in a much less central way. I mean, in Chinese aesthetics, though, there is a predominantly Taoist, or at least poetic tradition that we associate with the Taoist side of the Chinese sensibility that emphasizes the simplicity of nature. On the whole, Chinese aesthetics puts much more emphasis on the ornate and the intricate. And there's plenty of that in Japan, but always, the ideal, again and again, from the Middle Ages onward, has been balancing that with nature and not allowing a love of artifice to alienate you from the beauty of the natural world. And then there's another distinctive element of it that fascinated me from an early times, is that it's the only really refined aesthetic tradition I know that presumes beauty, but does not really discuss it. Beauty is the presumed backdrop. All of the distinctive Japanese aesthetic concepts have to do with other things, like simplicity, finding beauty where it's most unexpected, in things broken and discarded, even, as well as rough and unadorned. The ultimate effect of which, to mine, is some of the most exquisite art in the history of the world. Within a very specific range of sensibility, but literature and visual arts and drama that is unlike, and music, unlike what you find anywhere else in the world. And the last thing I'll say is the sheer challenge of of a Western mind trying to grasp any one of the dominant aesthetic values in the Japanese lexicon of aesthetic terms in their glossary. That in itself is such a challenge that it's sort of it's almost impossible to once you've entered the game.
Yeah, I've got a dry erase board actually full of those terms over here, and I've got lots of questions on individual terms. But the thing that you were saying that's stuck out to me when I conceived the idea to ask you to do this was, you're right. I mean, there's no equivalent to, like, Greek tokalos, right? Like beauty in the abstract sense. There's no discussion of the beautiful in that sense. And
yet, as you can see, it's everywhere presumed. I mean, the love of the flowering cherry tree, the love of saturated colors and exquisite fabrics. I mean, it goes beyond the pretty. It is obviously also already a veneration of the beautiful, but the beautiful as such is sort of the unspoken. The unspoken value. Everything else seems to be an approach by the back door. How to enter the realm of the beautiful without immediately vaulting up into the realm of the eternal. Rather than the Platonic eros that takes us from the beauty of the flesh to the beauty of spirit within 2 or 3 easy steps. In the Symposium, you go from an erotic fascination with Alcibiades to the love of the son of the good in a dialogue of 60 pages. The Japanese approach is utterly different. It's, learning mysteriously to dwell in the evanescent, the distant, the veiled, the half glimpsed, and within that context, experiencing all that within the embrace of a profound devotion to the beauty of nature and of human works.
Yeah. Would that we all had an erotic devotion to Alcibiades, right?
It seems to have helped Socrates along the way. It's
Yeah. Yeah, no.
Well, apparently he was a very impressive guy, Alcibiades. A great writer, a great athlete, a great dramatist, physically and intellectually superior, but lacking in a certain moral gravity, it turns out.
Yeah, and in Thucydides, the clear. I mean, I think it's interesting. Plato zooms in. This is a sidebar, but Plato zooms in on Alcibiades. It's interesting how Thucydides sort of doesn't think very much of Alcibiades, and he zooms in on Nicetas, right? Yep. Anyway, yeah. So,
well, I mean, Alcibiades is a problem for all of classical culture, right? Because on the one hand, he seems to embody all these magnificent skills and virtues, but he lacks the mean. He lacks the one thing needful to turn all of this into a moral harmony that's genuinely emulable. So Plutarch's treatment of Alcibiades is instructive as well. The later sort of rigid, very devout Greco-Roman reading of Alcibiades is still a thorn in the side of classical culture. On the one hand, a fascination with him; on the other, absolutely deplore him. Now, in Japanese culture, you don't have quite that same kind of, because perhaps the discourse of the beautiful isn't united, and you don't have a concept like Kalakagathon, the good, the beautiful, and the good in one. That sort of moral judgment seems to be in suspense. The moral, in a sense, the moral content of Japanese aesthetics is humility, not necessarily perfect virtue, but nonetheless an unwillingness to indulge in ostentation for ostentation's sake, and allowing the natural beauty of things and the beauty that's imbued in things by time and by their decay as much as by their fabrication and their growth, to reveal itself to you. And so, a refined sense of restraint is the closest thing to a virtue associated with aesthetics that you find in the classical Japanese canon of aesthetic terms.
Yeah. And so I mentioned that, aesthetics almost plays the unitive role that in other cultures religion does for Japan, but there are, of course, religions and philosophies in Japan that contribute to this aesthetic culture.
I think Shinto most particularly, yeah.
Yeah. So for those who are maybe like unaware or less familiar, like, could you trace the development of like Shinto Buddhism, and sort of packaged with Buddhism as it came to Japan, some elements of Confucianism and Taoism? Not only kind of how do these influence Japanese culture, but like what impact do these have on Japanese aesthetics?
Well, I mean, Shinto, of course, is the true native cultus of Japan. It didn't until the modern period even pretend to have a body of dogma. It's a reverence, first of all, of the kami, these spirits that inhabit nature, gods, you could call them, or spirits. I mean, and in that sense, it's a sort of how can I say it, unpremeditated form of animism in some of its earliest forms, but it has its own pantheon, its own myths of creation, for instance. But again, in its original forms, it's characterized more by form than by propositional content. Keeping the rituals, venerating your ancestors in a particular way, visiting torii, the torii are certain kinds of those ritual gates, such a beautiful aspect. You sort of mysteriously in the middle of nowhere, you pass through the torii, sometimes even when you're on the water. And this, marks an entrance into a sacred space. But, dancing is more important than doctrine in Shinto tradition. And it was the indigenous religion of Japan from a time that's incalculably old. In the 19th century, there was actually a kind of Shinto fundamentalism, if you like, or at least a kind of nationalist Shinto revival, prompted by scholars, especially, the great Motoori Norinaga, who did, I think I have here his edition of the Kojiki, for instance, which is one of the two bodies of Shinto myth and legend, the other being the Nihongi. And that, was a sort of a nationalist revival movement that led to the progressive rejection of such foreign contaminants as Buddhism and the Confucian tradition and Christianity and other things that had it's the 19th century, 18th, 19th century movement. And that led, unfortunately, in time, ultimately to the kind of state Shinto that flourished mid-century and became associated with the rise of Japanese nationalism and fascism. But that's not real Shinto. I mean, that is a modern fabrication. The real thing is simply a kind of way of dwelling with the spirits of nature. I suppose we would call it a paganism, in that vague sense. And most of Japanese aesthetics, in some sense, are this love specifically of natural form, natural growth, the passing of the seasons, both the waxing and the waning of things, is deeply rooted in the Shinto sensibilities, sense of the ubiquity of kami and tama, these nature spirits, and a realm by which one also is in contact with former generations of one's own family. But in the history of Japanese religion, actually, I mean, because there was a kind of doctrinal plasticity. Did you just get a call there on your phone?
Oh, no. Sorry. Did I make a
sound from somewhere? Don't worry about it.
Oh, anyway.
It could quite uncontentiously merge with currents that flowed over from China, including that element of Taoism that's in Chan Buddhism, and that element, Confucianism was adopted. Keeping the rituals is perfectly harmonizable with Shinto tradition and Buddhism. There have been times of tension between the different religious movements, but at the cultural level, there's always been a profound harmony. But I do think that what's distinctive in Japanese aesthetics, with all apologies to D.T. Suzuki, it comes more from Shinto originally than from Buddhism. Now, one supreme aesthetic value in the endless glossary of aesthetic terms that you get in Japanese is enso, and that is a very Buddhist notion of shunyata, the emptiness that is expressed by the divine in the constant attempt to paint a perfect circle, which the fullness, the allness, the nothingness at once is expressed. And so enso is a kind of the closest thing to the son of the good hovering over the whole gallery of aesthetic terms. But for the most part, when you look at the values of traditional Japanese aesthetics, not necessarily modern Japanese aesthetics, you're in a world of nature spirits in a very real sense.
Yeah, ranging from the more personal, right, to the less personal. I mean, you get everything from like Amaterasu to the rice god. There's a small portable temple actually for the rice god at the St. Louis Botanical Gardens. That I pointed yeah. So I pointed it out to my friend once, and he asked me like, so what do you think about that? And I was like, I don't know, probably there's a rice god in there, or there was at some point. I mean, what's the problem? I'm just saying the world is better with rice gods in it.
I mean, look, I mean, I always, it's this Protestant superstition that gods are some sort of rival to God, which is just a modal catachresis. It's a logical error to think that gods would be anything other than different sorts of creatures. They couldn't possibly be rivals for God in the fully transcendent sense. It's simply a mirage of language. Too bad that we don't have something like the Greek. The best we can do is capitalize God and relegate the gods to lowercase subordination. But in Greek, ο Theos and the various Theoi are not rivals for the same place in reality. And I'm all for making as much room for the spirits and gods of Japan as I am for the ones of the West. In fact, more and more, I'm becoming convinced that the only sane sort of Christian view of things is a kind of panpsychism grounded in the universality of the Logos that would require that all natural forms, that first of all, the Logos as such knows from inside, so to speak, what it is to be any natural. There's already a ground of consciousness there, but that would also have to have the mode of the personal consciousness, say, of your mulberry bush. Now, I can't prove this, But it seems to me the personification of the mulberry bush in the form of a very small nymph-like being, let's call her Mulberria, is a closer approximation to reality than any sort of mechanist view of matter as intrinsically, dead and then possessing life only in the sense of vegetative growth. I mean, anything that is already in some sense known from the inside. And that's how we should relate to it. But this, again, it's just because the world is so much less interesting if that isn't true. Yeah. What's the point of not believing it? We've only got 70 here. So
I'm certainly there, I'm certainly with you on all of that. I mean, there's something not only charming, but also just superior, I think, about a culture whose worldview is like, no, yeah, there's like a kami who's in charge of ramen noodles. Like, there's a kami who's in charge of ramen noodles and who like taught humans how to make ramen and, whatever. It's like, yeah, that's just a better way of thinking about reality, I think.
It also explains, let's be honest, it explains a great number of things. I mean, let's be honest, there's so much that we don't really, the origins of so much of human culture are much more mysterious than we pretend they are. So I think that it just makes much better sense to assume that at some point culture had to start going from this or that, resident god or archon or whatever, angel.
Yeah. Okay, so probably, if someone's into Japanese aesthetics at all, probably like the fundamental value that people who are interested in this kind of thing are likely to be familiar with is the idea of wabi-sabi. Yeah. How do you understand these terms? Like, can you walk anyone who's not familiar through it?
Well, wabi and sabi were originally two different terms that just sort of naturally came together. And when you ask specialists how they would distinguish between them, they might say to you, sabi is more about the effects of time on things, and wabi is a more philosophical understanding of the nature of things as an ephemerality directed towards a natural end with its natural span of time. But what most people understand by wabi-sabi is just plainness, lack of adornment, a love of the simplicity that turns out to be more than simplicity. Being able, for instance, to appreciate a well-weathered piece of wood, to love a wooden gate, not just for how well it's carved, but the marks that time have left upon it that testify at once to its evanescence and to the way in which all human products and all natural products gravitate towards the same thing. Sabi is probably the older term, and it's from the verb sabu, which means to wane, to decrease, to pass away. But there's also, a noun that's evoked by the word susabi, which is, desolation, but not desolation in the sense of something hideous, not a hideous ruin, but that sense that can strike you, which is sort of a surprising experience. You can be in a desolate place and suddenly recognize how exquisite it is in its very emptiness. And let me think. There's another infinitive, sabito, which means actually the rusting away of, kind of, or the patina, to acquire a patina, or actually to rust. So as you can see, we're not talking here about the splendor of beauty, right? It can just mean, that same verb being to grow old, senescence.
There,
And
so they're putting.
and let's be, I mean, Japanese culture, like all Asian cultures, celebrates the beauty of age much more than, say, modern Western culture. I mean, at one time this would have been more understandable, but Asian culture in general, and Japanese culture in a special way, celebrates sort of the beauty of the wrinkled countenance, the stooped posture, celebrates them in painting and poetry, you know. And of course, there's also an adjective that's another adjective that goes with sabishi, right? Which just means to be alone or to be lonely, but again, not in a terrible sense. Um, Stillness. Okay. Wabi, as I said, tended to be a more philosophical term at first, but wabi and sabi became joined together in this conceptual portmanteau of wabi sabi, because strictly speaking, wabi is the appreciation of an austere beauty. You know, certain notes that in music that have a kind of dissonance to them are wonderful examples of the value of wabi, and a kind of the beauty of the serenely accepting life's vicissitudes. Yeah, this is the thing. This is the problem. Whenever you talk about Japanese aesthetic terms, is there's nothing you can boil them down to in the sing. There is no single corresponding term in Western languages for them.
So this isn't a lexical equivalent, but a semantic, I don't know, parallel or echo that comes to mind when I hear wabi sabi is tohu vavohu.
Well, yeah, but with tohu wa bohu, you really are dealing with chaos, right? I mean, that's something that is to be subdued in the Book of Genesis. And of course, you probably know that etymologically, there are all these theories that tohu is really, the same as teham, the primal ocean, which is the same as Tiamat in some sense, or Leviathan, whereas bohu is etymologically cognate to behemoth, monster of the land. So there's something to be conquered. That wabi and sabi are much more. It's not chaos. It's simply the place where order yields. Entropy maybe, but even then, a lovely sense that that in this world at least, the temporality of things is part of what makes them beautiful. That a cherry tree always in blossom would become banal. Wabu, wabu, the verb, again, as I said, just means to just like sabiteru. Well, not like sabiteru, more like, I mean sabu. Sorry, I'm not a great Japanese scholar. As I said, I dabble. Wabu, like sabu, it means to dwindle away, to fade away, to vanish, but in a sort of gentle, mysterious way, simply to pass over and nothing. And again, wabishi, the adjective has that desolate, deserted, abandoned, but not in a tragic sense, the way that you just find yourself alone sometimes in a place whose emptiness is its beauty. And you can see why all of this, in a sense, is in perfect harmony with the Buddhist concept that comes to reign of enso, of emptiness, because that emptiness is revealed in the dwindling and evanescence of things. But these are values that go back even into, as far as we can tell, into a deeper Shinto sensibility. I mean, I think the period when wabi sabi really begins to take root as as central to the Japanese lexicon of aesthetic terms is probably the 16th century, with Sennorikyu, the master of the tea ceremony, the man who took the chanoyu and turned it into an art that was far less opulent by the time he was finished with it than when he began. He was the chief tea master, the master of the tea ceremony of a very powerful daimyo or lord. And he began more.
Right?
Yes, very good.
Yeah.
So I keep forgetting you actually know things. Not everyone who interviews.
Sometimes, every so often.
Oh, I shouldn't put it that way. Everyone who interviews me is always a genius and knows more than I do. But Sendo Rikyu, who was born in the I guess the 1522 or thereabouts, I think. I could look on Wikipedia, but then I'd have to close this page. And he died short of the turn of the century, sometime in the 1590s. And he began more and more to use prefer simple vessels to ornate vessels, because ornament interrupted the sheer elegance and simplicity. On the one hand, the homeliness, but also the austere perfection of the experience of the tea ceremony. He more and more preferred, simple vessels, simple implements, tea houses that were wood with tatami matting, stones, I believe he was the one who first started trying to, use water on the stones leading up to the tea house to approximate the effect of dew, so that you always felt that you were, passing through a dewy garden in the morning.
Wasn't he the one who?
And the practice of the sheer grace of simplicity. It's not plainness. I mean, it's not, in no sense is it a kind of indolence where it comes to form. In fact, if anything, it's more rigid. It was more rigid in his practice than it was beforehand. Instead of it is a tea ceremony, and there are proper forms for everything. How many times you stir the matcha, how you turn the vessels first when serving them and then when drinking, and how you give thanks and all that. And yet, the experience of it's extraordinarily profound, because you're taking everyday things of plain and simple and readily acquirable objects, and sort of integrating them into a pattern of exquisite refinement that you're sharing together with another person. And there's no other culture on earth I know of that would have or could have created something like the Chandoyu. It's a perfect example of the oddity from outside of the Japanese approach to the beautiful. And yet again, as I say, it's also, you're talking about a culture in which there's no prejudice against a love of the beautiful and the exquisite. To be at the high point of the Bushido, to be a truly accomplished samurai would not in fact involve a kind of manly contempt for daintiness. Quite the contrary. The samurai who's also a fine gardener and flower arranger, and who knows how to conduct the tea ceremony, and who probably cherishes no higher desire in life than to be able to die in the spring while the cherry blossoms are blowing through the air. That's a good samurai. The Japanese ability to aestheticize anything, which kind of reaches a somewhat questionable pitch, say in Tanazaki's famous book, In Praise of Shadows, in which there's a passage in which he praises the traditional Japanese latrine for its aesthetic virtues. It, again, is what sets this tradition apart.
Yeah, there are fun stories about Rikyu. There's the one where he is alleged to have said to his disciples, like, the tea ceremony is nothing other than heating up water with leaves and pouring it. And then there's a great story where he allegedly had, I mean, I say allegedly like it's uncertain, this is probably true. He had a morning glory or a marigold garden, one of the two, and Hideyoshi wanted to see it, And right before Hideyoshi came, Rikyu had the entire garden like culled, basically, like cut off all the stems, and then there was just one left, right,
Right.
in the shrine or in the tea house in the garden. And Hideyoshi, realizes the lesson. And
Well,
eventually,
what's funny, of course, is Hideyoshi's tea house originally is a tea house, notoriously, not famously, but notoriously a tea house of gold. And so you have to imagine that Sen Norikyo is sort of weaned him away from that sort of ostentation in improving, showing to him that the plain clay cup, even one that's been broken and restored. In fact, there's a whole Japanese art of restoring broken things and then treasuring the brokenness of their character. Could be more exquisite, more beautiful. That it lingered more lovingly on the threshold between the natural and the artificial. Which, if you think about it, I mean, what is the central image? What is the symbol of Shinto? The way the cross is for Christianity, or the crescent for Islam, or the Star of David. You'd have to say the Torii. It's the gate. It's this place of mystical liminality between the world of spirit and the world of human beings, but in a sense that dwelling on the threshold also between the natural and the artificial, between the human world, which is a sheltered world created with the beneficence, obviously, of certain kami and tama, yeah, and then the world of nature, which is a world full of the mystery of spiritual beings, that's all alive and in a sense, that's that aspect of Shinto, that always being on the threshold, is probably very much the secret inner core of the aesthetic, of the sensibility we're talking about. Because every bit as important as wabi sabi in traditional Japanese aesthetics, and wabi sabi itself. In fact, I typed up a list here of the terms, see if I can find them right. They're the seven, right? The principles of wabi sabi, kanso, fukinsei, koko. They all mean things like asymmetry or simplicity or something weathered. Shisen, unpretentiousness. Seijaku, tranquility. Datsutsuku, unbounded, unconventional in the sense, but meaning unconventional. Instead of not being so punctilious about form that you don't allow a natural flow of things to at times to overwhelm mere artifice. But the other, another term that's probably equally important for understanding, and in a sense, you could arrange most of the Japanese aesthetic terms between, on the one hand, this is Yugen, mm-hmm. which is sometimes associated with wabi sabi, but is a richer concept too. Or concept in its own right, because that means something dark and shadowy in one sense, but again, not in a terrible way, not in a frightening way. It's Yugen is about something hidden in such a way that it's just coming to light. Its obscurity, in a sense, is also disclosing something about it. It's a sort of mysterious surfeit of feeling. Somehow you're feeling going beyond what's immediately visible, but there's something just beyond, something withheld.
Something to some degree, the ineffability, right?
Well, yeah, the most famous characterization of Yugen comes from the great, the poet and playwright and theorist, aesthetic theorist Seami, who wrote all those great no dramas. Something just beyond reach, but also something at a great distance that you're aware of but can't quite see. Or Chome, the author of the great, that wonderful little treatise about the hut. One of the greatest works of human literature, really, only about 15 pages long. I'm trying to remember what it's called. I've forgotten its name suddenly. It's one of my favorite books, and so I can't remember its name. It'll come to me. Anyway, yes, he describes Eugen as sort of the an autumn evening, and the sky is colorless and silent, and for reasons we can't quite express, tears are welling into our eyes, and then he likens that to mountains in the autumn with the autumn colors, but viewed through a mist, so that they're only slightly visible, and a few leaves in the forest are distinctly visible. Well, that's sort of like Zayami saying that Eugen is like setting out into the forest, not knowing if you'll ever come back, not caring, and coming, in the distance, there's a mountain lake, it's very, again, Eugen is one of those things that you can sort of get the feel of, but for which there is no precise corresponding term in our time.
It's a quality that Alan Watts comes back to again and again in his book, The Wisdom of Insecurity. And I think that's more or less what he means by that phrase, the wisdom of insecurity, is sort of living, not comfortably maybe, but like living aware of and accepting of the quality of Eugen, right, in the world, that things are ineffable and things are sort of always, all of our conceptual discursive attempts to sort of master reality are, the minute we stop taking them to be pedagogy, are actually hindering us, right, from being able to interact with the world.
Well, yeah, and I think, and of course, as an aesthetic value, I mean, it's again and again you'll be told more by Western scholars than necessarily by Eastern scholars, that Eugen must be thought of as this worldly. And that's true in the sense that the phenomena that you're experiencing, the feelings you're experiencing, are very much everyday phenomena. But there is a profound spiritual awareness there, recognizing that preserving the mystery is necessary for the appreciation of it. I mean, that a mystery is not, that mysteriousness is not simply an invitation to dispel the clouds and dispel the darkness and immediately grasp the essence of something. That in a sense, being denied access to that knowledge is itself also part of the experience of ephemerality, transience, and the beauty of dwelling in a world that always exceeds what we think we can know, and that excess is itself part of what binds us to it and makes a claim on our love.
Yeah. So I another quality that we haven't yet talked about at great length. I was wondering, so many of the qualities that you mentioned, like Fukinse, Kanzo, Koko, Shizen, they have to do with they have to do with a realism that I would say Western art, even by the time you get to the Renaissance, when like realism becomes important, it's, Renaissance realism is still like very ideal insofar as, you want to present realistic portraits of ideal people and things and places and whatever. But this is a realism that's like celebrating, flaws, defects, or at least what we perceive conventionally to be flaws or defects. It's celebrating the specificity and particularity of things. And so that's also where we get this concept of like shibui or shibusa,
Right.
right?
Yeah,
Like the
yeah.
roughness.
Simplicity, subtlety, unobtrusiveness, but also, you're right, flawed. You know, I mean, that's a term from the Muromachi period, of course, and a very rich period for the development of the Japanese art. And that's the adjectival form of the noun shibua or shibumi, which means literally astringent, dry, something like the effect of a persimmon on the tongue, while also meaning unobtrusive and subtle. So it's sort of a combination of the unobtrusive and the bitter. It's associated actually a lot with subdued colors. A well-made, a well-made simple kimono will be described in those terms if it's, say, as a pleasantly simple pattern of gray blue against a soft gray or white background. Anyway, you were going to say something about it.
No, yeah, I was just gonna, I was gonna note that there seems to be, and maybe you could point out how this resolves a little bit more. It seems to me that there's something of a contrast or tension between shibui on the one hand and this concept of miyabi or elegance or
Yeah, but even then, miyabi is the elegance of restraint. Right. So, I mean, you're right. It's elegance. There are more humane and more, I mean, when you get in the modern period, of course, there's the value of iki, which is not a natural, which is not a feature of nature. It's very much an aesthetic value of the urban human world. But even then, none of these is ever entirely free from that insistence upon restraint. I mean, miyabi is elegance, it is refinement, but it also resists excess. If you know what I mean. Have I still got
you? Yeah, I excuse me. Yeah, I'm thinking in terms of like, like in the Heian era, for example, right? When Miyabi and Mono no Aware, this like nostalgic, heartbreaking experience of transience. It's like
right. I mean, when we talk about Miyabi, we often think of the Heian period, the Heian literature, and that is the richest period for one thing. I mean, it's one of the most civilized periods in Japanese culture before the sort of the age of the shogunates and the sort of more martial Japanese culture in general. And it produced all the great literature actually dominated by women of the imperial court, like Murasaki Shikabu and The Tale of Genji. And I suppose that we think of Miyabi, as courtliness as well, right? And it's often associated with the ceremonies of romancing a perhaps inaccessibly highborn lover, sending poetry across a courtyard into the inner chambers where the women are, for instance, or something like that. But on the whole, it still involves, a sense of proportion. Miyabi is never expressed either in the Heian period or afterwards in sheer opulence in the way that, again, as I say, certain periods of Chinese aesthetics embody, just absolute overwhelming displays of color and artifice and ornament. For all the beauty and the elegance and the grace we associate with the Heian ideals of the court, even there's an insistence on a golden mean, so to speak. And you mentioned, I mean, in association with it, which is very astute of you, Mono no Aware, right?
yeah.
And that's just, I mean, literally the gasp, the ah, that escapes your voice when you encounter, you know, to put it, um, when you encounter something for which you have no words, but that inspires in you a kind of wistful awe, and a kind of melancholy that's also a kind of grateful detachment, right? I mean, this is the way to think about it. It's not a gasp of simple pleasure as such. It's the gasp, that's also an alas, you know.
Yeah, it's almost a kind of practical meditative exercise in I mean, by the Heian period, Buddhism is totally there in Japan, but it's not yet, fully filtered everywhere. But it is to
I
some
mean, it's
extent.
there. I mean, it's still occupied at that point. It occupies a very high place in the culture, in the sense that the court ladies who want to escape the let's say a marriage they don't want, or a widowhood they don't feel like living through, have the refuge of the convent, the Buddhist convent, and the monastic world is full of aristocrats, not just simple monks and nuns, but in a sense it's become a retreat, like many a monastery and convent in European history at certain periods. So it's Buddhism is there. It has risen very high. In a way, it never really did in China. Let's be honest. In China, even though there were Buddhists, there are periods of greater and lesser influence. Most Chinese imperial the culture of the court remains sort of resolutely Confucian, and Buddhism in all of its forms, like Taoism, was regarded by the very cultured quite often as a kind of fanaticism, or something that may be true, but or good, but ultimately in Japan, by this period, by the Heian period, 1,000 years ago, it had become part of court life.
Yeah, and so in a sense, then Mono no Aware is sort of like it's almost like a meditative practice of recognizing the emptiness of things in that very Buddhist metaphysical sense, right? That the contingent reality has no sort of self-existence, so to speak. But that at the same time sort of frees you to.
Right, that's the intellectualized version of it, the one that's more in keeping with Enso as a kind of ultimate value in aesthetics. But in detaching it from its metaphysical appetites, it's originally, I mean, I really think it is, there's this supremely Japanese sense of just taking a pleasure, but always, again, a tempered, even somewhat melancholy pleasure. Yes, in detachment, but in just the passing of time, in the cycle of natural growth and decay, and of youth and age, it does come more, I think you're right, to be associated with Buddhist language of the void, and the emptiness of intrinsic being, and the emptiness of all things. But I think originally it has a much humbler origin. It's simply delighting in the cherry blossom that's here today and gone tomorrow. And I think that the Buddhist reading of that is sort of after the fact, historically speaking.
Yeah. And of course, today it's just it's tourism. you can
Well,
you can chase the cherry blossom season like from the north to the south, or vice versa. I can't remember which.
yeah, I mean there are worse things to ask tourists to. I mean, there are worse things to want to do with your time if you're a tourist. I mean, but it's true. Of course, I'm from Maryland, and the cherry blossoms, the Chinese cherry trees in D.C., that of course were a gift of the Japanese government. I'm trying to remember the year of the gift. Whatever the case, I mean, that always attract. We used to go there when they were in blossom, just 20 minutes down the road, and there are a lot of tourists from Japan come to see them as well. It's
Yeah, speaking of Asian gifts to the United States, I'll never get over the fact that we could have had elephants. We were offered elephants for the country. We were even offered war elephants
Yeah,
for
Thailand offered us war elephants during the Civil War. We
yeah.
did briefly experiment with camels after the Civil War, as in the Western deserts, but for some reason the experiment didn't take hold. But
I mean, just imagine how, like, on the one hand, war is awful. Yeah. But imagine how
is
much
that
crazier.
true? I mean, do we really have a record of the King of Thailand, or the King of Siam, that is, offering his elephants, or is that just part of the mythology from Anna and the King of Siam? From
Yeah,
King and I.
I need to recheck it. If I remember
I read the
correctly,
book. No, she says. I mean, she says it in the book, but there are many questionable details of the book. I'm wondering if we actually have it in the archives, a letter to Abraham Lincoln from the King of Thailand, because he was actually quite an intelligent and learned man, contrary to the somewhat cartoonish version you get of him in the musical and in the original film and in the book even. The Yul Brynner portrayal is entertaining, but it's not all that accurate.
yeah, not that accurate. Though I will admit that I think
Chow Yun Fat played him in the more recent, right? Am I right about that? Played him in the one with Jodie Foster.
I think that's right. I think that's right.
Anna
Yeah.
the King, yeah, right.
Yeah. There's something about so like that movie is very interesting for a number of reasons, but I've always thought that like a Buddhist take on Uncle Tom's Cabin struck me as like more interesting than the Southern Protestant take on it, like the invocation of the Buddha for salvation. I was like, no, yeah, like,
oh no, yes, I think it in a sense. I mean, of course, I'm not sure that happened either. I'm pretty sure that's entirely apocryphal, but
yeah, that's definitely for the musical, and like, right. I'm very certain someone rightly has issues with that entire sequence in that movie.
Well, in Thailand has I mean, because of course I can't remember his name. I'm being very forgetful today. I'm sorry about that. He is a revered figure in Indo-Chinese, or culture in general, but in Thailand especially. There's long been a deep hatred of those films in Thailand. Mongut, that's it. Mongut, King Mongut. He was Rama the Fourth. I have to admit, I just looked it up on my Wikipedia. Don't tell anyone I've ever even heard of Wikipedia.
Yeah. But, Wikipedia gets a really bad rap, but honestly, for just
I think actually, in a sense, there's a kind of Darwinian quality to it that I like. That is the people who actually know things more and more go into go in online to fix the errors of others, and slowly over the course of time, what emerges are some fairly accurate articles. There's a very good one on the authorship of the Shakespearean corpus, for instance, that I read a couple of years ago, and I was impressed at how much of the information was very good, very good scholarship. So I'm not as contemptuous as all that. Anyway, and by the way, while I'm at it, Chome, his great work is the Hojiki. The reason I couldn't remember it is I kept thinking Kojiki because I was talking about Shinto a little while ago. Hojiki, the four square hut. One of the most exquisite works of prose in the Japanese canon, certainly, but a work that everyone should read. And in some ways, perhaps the most perfect expression, along with maybe the Sarashina diary, of many of those aesthetic values we're discussing. The exquisite simplicity and lyricism of simplicity of classical Japanese literature. But as I said, there are other values, other values over time. Again, values with names, words, for which there are no correlates in our language. But the most famous of the more modern would be Iki, right? And that really is from a wholly different world. I mean, that's a value associated with the urban class, young men particularly, who, and precisely how you understand this word. In one sense, it just means being cool, being spontaneous, having a certain uniqueness about your personality that no one else can, a certain charisma and originality. But also because it's Japanese, part of the virtue of Iki is resignation, lack of vaunting ambition, being gallant, but being gallant in part because you're not attached to things, One, I think it was Tanizaki or one of or someone talking about Tanizaki's in Praise of Shadows, which isn't about Iki. There is a very famous book about Iki, but described it as guarding possibility as possibility. And now how we would coordinate that with the values of gallantry, elegance, restraint, non-attachment, stylishness, looseness. It also a preference for muted colors like gray, dim blue, brown, preferring stripes to floral design. Iki, the lighting for Iki is supposed to be indirect lighting, so that there's a sort of, you can imagine Bogart or Jean Gabin smoking a cigarette in a bar where the lighting is indirect. That has something of the quality of Iki about it.
There's a kind of melancholy to some modern Japanese aesthetics, and I'm thinking especially in terms of like cinema and television that comes out of Japan. So like one of the, and I don't know, there's almost a kind of like, there's a melancholy and then there's like a really simplistic kind of joy. So two shows that I like on Netflix, one is called Samurai Gourmet, and it's about this old retiree who just wants to go places and eat during the day with his retirement, but he can't like bring himself to order the stuff he really wants because it's it's that restraint, like it's too extravagant to do so. So then he hallucinates.
This is part of the great spiritual quandary of the Japanese soul,
Yes. Like in the first episode, he wants to order a beer at lunch, and he's like, "Oh no! Like, what if everyone judges me?" So he just hallucinates a Ronin who like comes into the restaurant and like gives him the courage to just do whatever he wants to, right? It's like every episode. But then you have something like Midnight Diner, which is about one of these late night eatery places for working class people, and kind of every story, every individual, like their individuality, their uniqueness is also kind of the cause of why they're so sad all the time, right?
Yeah.
Like there is
Well,
a sense
that would be very much a sort of Iki sort of character, I suppose, or atmosphere.
yeah.
I mean, the most famous treatise on Iki as a distinct aesthetic value, right, is by I'm trying to remember, it's kind of funny. It's Kuki. It really is very hard to say. You know, I get sort of the schoolboy pleasure in Iki is Iki and Kuki, and Bukuki Shuzo. And he wrote a treatise called Iki no Kozo, which is sort of like the structure of the shape of Iki. And it does, there is a good edition of it by the writer, the novel is Hiroshi Nara, but there's an English translation that's quite good of that. I have it around here somewhere. Oh, here we go. Everyone who's actually fascinated by this, I'm sort of trying to not get it. Just see you reflected in its shiny cover. There we go. Read it obliquely.
Okay, yeah.
You mentioned I don't know the programs you're talking about, but it is worth mentioning that all of these elusive, lovely, and frustratingly ineffable Japanese aesthetic values, I think, are part of the reason why Japan, for a time, produced so great in cinematic culture. There are three great, truly great cinematic culture. They're great. There's great cinema from many different countries, but the U.S., France, and Japan, you can say, had sustained periods of extraordinary excellence. And in Japan, of course, in addition to the big three, Mizoguchi, Kurosawa, Ozu, there are other wonderful directors like Inagaki and Kobayashi, wonderful director who did, of course, Kwaidan and Harikiri and other masterpieces. And a little earlier than that, did I mention Inagaki, or I might have just said that?
I think you just did. Yeah.
Yeah, the Musashi trilogy and other things. And Teshigahara slightly later, also a great director. This is a cinema. Now, Kurosawa was, in many regards, perhaps the most Western as a storyteller. Even then, he's willing to, his films, let's say, stretch out a little bit farther than most Western cinema, most directors in the West, or at least most studios, felt comfortable with. But in one sense, Mizoguchi is the greatest purely Japanese director in sensibility. In another way, perhaps Ozu. Ozu is kind of hard for Western audiences to take. I mean, these are incredibly slow and simple. But if you want, to see how this sense of the very simple, the plain, the unadorned, the unostentatious can express itself in cinema. Watch Tokyo Story or something by Ozu. The camera is remarkably static. I have to confess, the older Ozu got, the more he was sort of like trying to concentrate on the perfect framing. So you have a scene in which the camera hardly moves within a 10-minute, which the percent. But and to be honest, the first time, most Western viewers start checking their watches at times, but you get drawn in. I find that in the past. Of the big three, Ozu is my least favorite because I have maybe an purely occidental attention span when it comes to this. In fact, by the end, you find yourself caring deeply about the characters in these films and these very simple stories. But for me, the sort of the supreme Japanese director, just for integrating all the virtues of Japanese aesthetic tradition from the classical to the modern period, is, of course, Mizoguchi. Now, if we're talking about Iki, of course, they're the cooler, the hipper, later, like Suzuki, and that's something else. But I mean, the films like Ugetsu or Sancho the Bailiff or Tale from Chikamatsu or any or the any of it, or his version of the 47 Ronin, which is in two parts. It's an epic. So,
Yeah.
It includes, some of the most perfect use of natural light, natural settings, but also of the weathered, the human dwellings that are treated with this, almost obsessive fascination with their disproportion. And then Tales, he when he was making Ugetsu, for instance, he wanted to make it like there's a tradition of story scrolls in Japan in which a tale is told in successive pictures, and you unroll the scroll at one end and roll it up the other. So in a sense, it's sort of a classic precedent for cinema as such. And he wanted to tell the story in that way. And so he uses the camera in this way. He wanted the camera to sort of float at times in on and of course it's a ghost story, so floating a slight movement of the camera. It was hugely influential actually on Martin Scorsese later, whose camera is always in motion. But if you just want to see, to me, like the perfect cinematic expression of the Japanese aesthetic tradition, that would be the film Ugetsu.
Okay.
Sancho the Bailiff also, but after watching Sancho the Bailiff, you can't be happy again for about 4 years. So you have to be prepared for that one, because it's like one of the most shattering films ever made.
For what it's worth, Seven Samurai is my favorite movie.
Well, I should hope it's among them, certainly. Yeah, no, Kurosawa. I'm not in any way suggesting Kurosawa is inferior to Mizoguchi. I just mean that Kurosawa was a bit of a maverick, and he had he loved Western storytelling. So he's sort of a mediating figure between East and West, and between the Japanese and the American British style of. I guess you would say there was a great British cinema, but it was it was mostly subsumed into American cinema. And the best period, so quickly, after some wonderful, Pinewood Studios films disappeared very quickly. But
and to your point about Scorsese, I mean, I think a lot of people are often unconscious of how influential Japanese cinematography was on some of the most popular. I mean, the Star Wars, for example. I mean, you don't get George Lucas without
the secret, right, the secret Citadel or whatever it's called.
The Hidden Fortress or Seven Samurai. I mean, like right. These films are like so influential.
Right. There's a reason why sword fighting is that that whole generation of filmmakers, both Coppola obviously has been older. But George Lucas, who used to be a great director, by the way, people may not know this, but he started out with THX 1138 and American Graffiti, which are great pieces of cinema. He then just apparently lost his way after the first Star Wars film. But also, John Milius, who's a horrible director, but he got the others interested in Kurosawa. And, horrible director with horrible politics. But part of what inspired, there are different, in American cinema, of course, it's the great period of the 30s and 40s, but the late 60s and early 70s, of course, is also a golden period in American cinema. And many of the directors who created genuinely great films in that period were inspired by Japanese cinema, and both the classical Japanese cinema I'm describing and what was called Japanese New Wave cinema, which was somewhat more violent and insane. And So yes, so what I love about talking to you is it's like a conversation that has absolutely no structure and is occurring while we're waiting for the damn train to arrive, and it's 30 minutes late. So once again, we're wandering in every direction.
You've already given me two blurbs that I could easily put on anything going forward. One is, I forget that you actually know things. And then the other is that what I love talking to you is that there's no structure to it, which are both true. This is the consequence of having thinly undiagnosed ADHD and cyclical hyperfixations throughout the year.
No, I mean, I'll admit, I'm always happy to talk about these things. It's just, of course, obviously, I don't know what the ultimate effect is going to be when people are watching this. I think that these, shouldn't they at least have had an outline?
Well, I do have one. So, I didn't pitch this to you as a talk about theology, and mostly because we've done that twice. Yeah, everyone, and I know you typically like this. Theology tends to be what you get asked to do, and I was like, well, it's not that I'll never ask.
Curiously enough, it's one of the things I like least talking about. Yeah. I don't enjoy talking theology all that much. I find that the conversation simply becomes a matter of old conversations recycled. But anyway, go on.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess my one sort of version.
I'm trying to prevent you from asking a theological question.
Oh, okay,
that's what you're about to do, but I'll let you ask it if you understand, with the stipulation that if I don't want to, I don't have to answer it.
Oh, that's the general rule.
Okay.
Yeah, no worries. No, I was just gonna observe. When we think about God as the non-dual being, consciousness, and bliss of all things, I think there's something then that Japanese aesthetics, and I'm just interested in what you think about this. I mean, there's something useful, and more than just useful. I mean, there's something eliminative about a culture that, yeah, sure, like there are gods, right? There are divinities, there are spirits, there are whatever. But the goal is not to dogmatize about these things. The goal is not to doctrinalize. The goal is simply to kind of like live in the world and celebrate the world's worldness, right? And there's one perspective from which you could say like, oh, well, that's not enough focus on God, I guess. But then like if you have this kind of non-dual attitude, then it's like, well, I mean, what they're there is nothing other than God. So what they're celebrating is God.
Well,
right?
I mean, what do we mean by dwelling in the world? In the West, you're likely being worldly means being thoroughly secularized, having thrown off the burden of superstition or the demon-haunted world or whatever. Now, technically, if you have any, every poll of the Japanese that's taken, would seem to give us the impression of a non-religious culture, right? Thoroughly secularized, because dogmatically, most Japanese won't admit to being anything as such. If they happen to be Christians, they'll admit to that. Some, I mean, the Buddhists, you basically have to go to the monasteries to find the ones who will just say they're Buddhists, right? But when you actually explore what the world is in the Japanese imagination, to the majority of Japanese to this day, it is nothing like the desacralized, the disenchanted, the mechanized world of Western modernity. I mean, I among my Japanese acquaintances, I have some over the years because of just context on various things, on aesthetics, philosophy, theology, baseball. I actually have some Japanese baseball Japanese approach to baseball, by the way, is a beautiful thing, I have to tell you. But
baseball.
In fact, if baseball survives the barbarism of the American ownerships and rules committees, it'll be because Japan keeps it alive for us as a true art. But I can't think of any of my friends who actually is a materialist in the sense we'd recognize in the West. they tend to think, yeah, there are spirits in nature, and they do, engage in Shinto practices not simply as a sort of formality, but they do it with some expectation that there's something on the other side of that gate that's responding to them. I've never yet met a Japanese person who truly, absolutely dogmatically doesn't believe in ghosts. I mean, in Japan, I'm sure there are such persons, but you can read newspaper stories in Japan about hauntings that are treated more or less as you might have a newspaper story about a car accident. After the tsunami that destroyed well, among other things, the Fukushima power plant, the nuclear facility, but killed so many people, there were stories in the press about the local emergency agencies, firemen and such, receiving phone calls for help from parts of the the area that had been wiped out by the tsunami, from phone lines that should have been dead, and it was just reported in a sort of almost matter-of-fact way in the Shimbun, I can't remember the name of the paper, that there were ghosts from the area that were, and that to deal with this, the local fire department or someone, the police chief or someone, had hired some Shinto clergy to go out there and deal with it and help these ghosts move along. This was a functioning society.
The Gundam factory in Yokohama hired Shinto priests to come and like bless the giant mech before they like put the head on and everything. Yeah, I mean it's not
a dwelling in the world in the modern Western sense of having taken leave of all sense of the mystery. Again, this love of Yugen as this insistence that it's a worldly value, in a sense, is an equivocation, because what is a worldly value in a society that hasn't passed through the Western history of the violent repudiation of an entire classical and medieval past in the form of a triumphalist modernity that bases itself on a mechanistic view of the world, and as a result treats the world purely as sort of reserve of technological resources to be exploited. Now, modern Japan more and more is becoming alienated from its past, from nature. More and more, the fascination with technology in Japanese, because that's one of the big, obviously, part of what drives its economy. People, the sort of the young people who stay forever inside their apartments enclosed within urban spaces and live in virtual worlds. That's the tragic other side of Japanese experience today, that the alienation from a world that's being killed by misuse and abuse and pollution and all the other things that carbon emissions, so on and so forth. And there much of the great, or not only the natural but the human beauty of Japan is still disappearing. Even Kyoto, one of the most beautiful cities on earth, still sees, unfortunately, a lot of modern urban development slowly but inexorably destroying what really should be a sacred. I mean, you realize that during the Second World War, we refused to bomb Kyoto. The Allies refused to bomb Kyoto because it was of such historical, it was a place of such beauty, and it was of no strategic value. But the notion of trying to demoralize the Japanese population by destroying Kyoto was floated and rejected, apparently, as simply too barbaric. Of course, Hiroshima and Nagasaki then qualify. So we don't win many points. We don't win many points for that, but
yeah. Well, and I think
So I
I
mean, modernity is conquering Asia and conquering Japan just as it is everywhere else. But as you say, this sense of dwelling in the world that is taken so seriously in Japanese aesthetic tradition is not a dwelling in a world that's been exorcised. You know, it's not a world from which the gods and the spirits have been chased away. If anything, it's uh, at times can be a kind of desperate clinging to that world as it slowly but apparently inevitably vanishes.
well, and even, I mean, as bad as all of that is too, it also seems to me that contemporary Japanese culture is still more enchanted in its attitudes and engagement with, you know, industrialization, with technology, with
Well,
whatever,
well,
that
you know,
for
I
reasons.
think, yeah, no, I mean, I think that, I mean, well, in fact, you know, I think that the least godly place on earth is the United States. Obviously, I mean that for all of the, you know, mythology of a god-haunted people, and for all of the formal adherence to religious associations and religious claims, that America was always already. Um, you know, the land without God. It was always one in which the world had already been, creation had already been converted into technological reserve, in which you know a kind of weird Pythagorean cult of capital had triumphed even before it became explicit, and that when our ancestors left Europe, they left Christianity behind, and that explains the sheer weirdness of the indigenous Christianities of America, you know, white evangelicalism and such, that bear no real relation to Christianity in any historical or scriptural or spiritually sane sense. They're all sometimes quite anodyne, but in other ways quite malign, as we saw the white evangelical world ally itself with a recent presidential administration, the name of which I never utter if I don't have to, because I don't like to curse.
Well, and we stamped out, we stamped out the indigenous
Sure.
religions for the most part. That, I mean, unlike in Japan, where when Buddhism goes to Japan, it just sort of melds with Shinto, or unlike
Yeah.
in Europe, where arguably, as I know you would agree with, I mean, Christianity just sort of absorbs a pre-existing cosmology. I mean,
I mean, I have
the
no
beauty
problem.
is,
Christianity is both a Jewish and a pagan religion, if as a religion, as a religious culture, and that's good.
yeah.
And well, of course Judaism too. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, Helen, you know, the Greco-Roman world, the sort of partitions we in
Yeah,
Hollywood
it doesn't
fashion,
really exist. Yeah,
right?
absolutely. But I mean, like here, we
No,
didn't perform that synthesis with what was already here, and it's sort of,
right.
I often wonder if that's not the reason why, um, and I mean, probably it just is, like, part of the reason why why our culture is so disenchanted is that,
And
the
so
people,
unenchanting.
and so unenchanting is that the peoples and traditions that could have taught us how to recognize the sacred, the divine, like in this place, we didn't. I mean, we just horrifically abused, right? um
Yeah, I mean, you can number that among the offenses that have produced who we are, and I think it's hard. I mean, I think there's a spiritual legacy of a country that is, you know, founded on spoliation and virtual, you know, near genocide and slavery, chattel slavery, you know, that you know that you know how we fancy liberals with our critical race theory are, you know, but I mean, quite seriously, that we've never not been aliens in this land, in the sense that we didn't come here to dwell in a place that had an identity, that had a, you know, genie locorum, you know. We came and we said, oh, you can make a profit from this. There's a lot of good wood here. There are heavy metals there. That's always been our attitude to it. It's it's the age of conquest. But the thing I find oddest about, as I say, is that you know the same is, you could say the same is true with conquistadores and such, but that in some sense a spiritual culture managed, albeit in a very tragic way. I'm not denying that, but what the Catholic culture and indigenous culture did in Latin, especially in South America, but also in Central America, managed to some degree to coexist and to cross-pollinate and without ceasing to be Catholic, without ceasing to be autochthonous.
Well, at the same time,
that did not happen. That didn't happen with us. I mean, with us, it was, we made a desert and called it peace. We came and the sort of religion that sprang up in America, this sort of weird after echo of Christianity, or not even that. I mean, like a reverse image of Christianity. This sort of weird Orphic, self-reliant cult of property, possessions, nation, guns, Donald Trump. Oh, I said it. That is the indigenous American Christianity is so remote from any Christianity. It's curious to think that they lost their Christian identity because they weren't able to learn anything from the non-Christian world that they entered. That in rejecting and despoiling and destroying the latter, they had already implicitly taken leave of the former. And what we have in America, we simply have the least spiritual, the least God-haunted country in the history of the world. Laicized France is more full of the presence of the memory of God than America's entire history.
And hence, I think it's fair to say why, people like you or me or others who are interested in, trying to make what is good metaphysics and good cosmology like a living experience and a living culture, however far we're able to, look with admiration, not necessarily rose-colored glasses, but with admiration to places like Japan, and to aesthetic traditions like the Japanese and other, as you were talking about, East and South Asian cultures, to China, to Thailand, to India, right?
And you don't have to do this through rose-tinted spectacles. We understand that all cultures have their strengths, their weaknesses, their sins, and their virtues, right? And what Christianity has brought into the global reality of human consciousness is an ethics premised on love that even those for whom it would have in previous centuries been a fairly alien value, nonetheless freely professed. So we understand that looking in that direction is not. I mean, I hope you understand. It's an admiration that doesn't require stupidity on our parts. It's a recognition that we have lost a great deal, and that we, as a force in the unfolding history of humanity, as a dominant force economically and culturally, are destroying many beautiful things in those other cultures as well, or part, at least complicit in that destruction. So,
absolutely.
But I interrupted you.
No, not at all. That's actually all I have. So, yeah.
Well, can I do a little bibliography thing here?
Of course, please do.
As I already showed you that the Nara edition of The Structure of Detachment, but there's certain books that occurred to me that your your devoted listeners.
Perennialists and digressors all.
Well, I don't have my copy of Hojiki here, for instance, or Basho's Road to the Deep Interior, classically, but books on Japanese aesthetics that are worth being aware of. One really has to read the treatises of Zayami and the Art of the No Drama. This volume in particular actually has all of his major treatises. When where the Japanese tea ceremony is concerned, of course, everyone knows Okakura, Kakuzo Okakura's book that he wrote in English, the Book of Tea, which is a lovely book, a million different editions. But if you're really interested in the deep cuts, if you really want to go into all of the minutiae of the different schools of Chanoyu, famous but great Australian scholar A.L. Sadler's book, The Japanese Tea Ceremony, at a very reasonable price from Tunnel. There's another famous book that everyone should know. Soetsu Yanagi's book, The Beauty of Everyday Things. This takes the Japanese love of the ordinary to an almost obsessive extreme. It's extravagantly plain. The wonderful praise of broken teacups. I mean, it's and a bizarre and delightful and weirdly idiosyncratic classic, of course, is Junichiro Tanazaki's In Praise of Shadows. I'm sure your watchers aware that Tanizaki is the second greatest novelist of the 20th century in Japan, after Kawabata Yasunari, at least in my estimation. I think in my nephew's estimation as well, and he's a great reader of the Japanese, modern Japanese literature. In Praise of Shadows is very short. Everyone should read it because there's nothing else quite like it. And it could only have been produced in Japan, but in Japan they would say it could only have been produced by Tanizaki. So.
Yeah, I would briefly.
Oh, and of course our Shinto classics, the Kojiki, the Nihongi.
Yes.
I won't go on.
No. Yeah, I'd also say a great, very short, very cheap, and very general overview to a lot of the stuff we talked about today is Donald Ritchie's A Tractate on Japanese Aesthetics.
I meant to mention that, and also, Donald Ritchie, of course, he's a fascinating character. The Tractate on Japanese Aesthetics is very, very short, very good, covers almost all of the major terms in as lucid a way as is possible in trying to convey their content to a Western audience. Also, his book, The Inland Sea, is worth reading, not because it's on aesthetics, but somehow it keeps coming back to the, in a sense, it's an elegy to, in a sense, a kind of an indigenous sort of Japanese cultural beauty that is slowly fading.
Yeah. So if you're interested in this kind of stuff, look up these books. David, as always, thanks for doing this. I hope you'll agree to do it again if I come up with something.
Yeah, I'll try to be a little bit sharper next time. I feel like I'm talking through an antihistamine haze at the moment, but
not at all. But I also understand. I'm a little bit. I'm nursing a cold myself this weekend, so no worries.
But it doesn't seem to be the Omicron variant. I just want to point out I've tested, so I don't know if these tests are accurate. But I think it was just a cold going around.
Yeah, I'm vaxxed and boosted, but I also teach middle school, so Lord
which
knows.
Is sort of like living in a petri dish, isn't it?
So, well, anyway, David, thanks. Good to see you.
And thanks for wanting to talk about this.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation, Rob and I have just put out our call for papers on our book on anime, religion, and theology, and one of the ways I want
talking Rob Delanoval.
Yes.
But,
Yes.
I have to say, Roberto, great guy. Oh, I have to send him an email today. Remind him. But I don't know anything about anime. I have to admit. You see, this. I live in a kind of artificial Japanese world of my own that includes the whole classical tradition and the great cinematic tradition and novels of the 20th century. But there's actually I'm strangely ignorant of Japanese popular culture, other than the sense of fear. Like when you see extracts from Japanese game shows, and you wonder if this is actually a foretaste of hell.
Well,
But I
so
don't.
one of the things that we're, I think, trying to kind of face head on in our intro to this is that, anime is a mixed bag. I mean, it has everything from uh kind of really lowbrow popular kinds of shows to like the films of Hayao Miyazaki, which are really
And I have
excellent.
seen a couple. I have seen a couple of those. I have to admit.
Yeah, yeah. So we're trying to. I think the pop culture and theology series, I think, just proceeds from the recognition that um, for a lot of people, they're kind of the only interaction they're ever going to have with bigger ideas about the world, or with these kinds of artistic representations of divinity or whatever. It's coming through the pop culture sources that are kind of
One of the things
biggest
that
and most
I
direct.
find fascinating. This much I know about. I know we're finished with our conversation, but this is a digression, right?
Yeah, yeah,
A
of
thin
course.
digression. Is the degree to which a lot of Japanese popular fantasy is concerned with Christian eschatology and Christian imagery, angels and the end of days, and the apocalypse of John. It's very strange to me, because in a sense, there may be no natural indigenous Japanese way of confronting the notion of historical crisis, of the end of the possibility of the end of things. That very much uh, a product of the Zoroastrian element in the Abrahamic religions, if you want to say whatever. And I find that fascinating, that even where Christianity as dogma or devotion is as a kind of marginal place in the culture, that this sort of imagery and these sorts of narratives are actually weirdly pervasive of a lot of popular Japanese storytelling.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think, one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation was to kind of orient myself around, understanding how anime sort of concretizes lots of different influences, some of them indigenous, some of them Western, and whatever. But I wanted to sort of get myself into the mindset of thinking through, like, okay, so which of these kind of traditional aesthetic qualities are still very big in the medium in different places, and which are the more modern ones, and sort of just like, where does this fit in the overall story? And I think sometimes you get productions that are very consistent with some of these traditional aesthetic ideals, and I think sometimes you get productions that are obviously not trying to be as serious, or obviously not trying to be as profound, or whatever.
Of course, perhaps Japanese culture reached its height also in Ultraman.
Yeah, yeah.
When
I'm
I
willing.
was 4 or 5, I was an avid watcher of Ultraman. So
I have to ask, who's if we're going to talk about Japanese popular culture for a couple of seconds here at the end, what's your favorite kaiju? No, nothing.
I have nothing for you. I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, it's okay. My personal favorite is Mothra, but I will say one of the funny things about the Godzilla movies is that when aliens start coming into them, the inside of all these alien spaceships tend to be Japanese tea houses, like very
Yeah.
traditional.
No, I mean that's always. I mean, look. I mean, as a kid, you got to understand. I mean, there was the original Godzilla film, which we only saw in its horribly mutilated version with Raymond Burr stuck in, because, of course, in those days, can't just have a can't have a popular. I mean, you could show Japanese cinema in art houses, but you couldn't have popular entertainment without a Westerner stuck in there, sort of as a. But the original Gojira, the original film was actually quite good. I like it, as a piece of popular entertainment and as a sly commentary on. Well, let's be honest, the United States occupation of Japan and the use of nuclear weapons. It has Shimada in it. What's his name? One of my favorite. Again, God, what a horrible memory I'm having today. The fellow who's also the chief samurai in the Seven Samurai.
Oh yeah. Okay, yeah.
There's almost like in all Kurosawa films, in Stray Dog, he's the older police. What was his name?
So hold on. The guy that I know who's in like every Kurosawa film is the kind of rough and tumble samurai in Seven Samurai. Is that the guy you mean, or do you mean the like strategist who dresses up as the Buddhist monk at the beginning of the movie?
I mean the latter, yes. Who? What was his name? Takashi Shimura. He and Toshiro Mifune Toshiro, were the two favorite actors of Kurosawa. He also came to love Tatsuya Nakadai, of course, and when he had his fallout with the name I just gave you, Toshiro Mifune, Nakadai became his go-to. So in Ron, for instance, Nakadai plays. But Takashi Shimura is in the original Gojira, and he's one of the truly great Japanese cinematic actors. But he's a Toho, so it'd be a Godzilla film or a Kurosawa film, whatever they assigned him to. But a wonderfully subtle actor, and his greatest film with Kurosawa is Ikiru, in which he plays the man who's dying of cancer. And Ikiru means to live. And how he is, meets the reality of his approaching death by building a playground for children. It's a wonderful film.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, I'm gonna have to watch that. Well,
all right.
I'll see you sometime.
Okay, take care.